The wind had been howling for 3 days when they came. Astrid pressed her weathered face against the frost-covered window of her longhouse, watching the snow pile against the abandoned homes across the village square. Each empty dwelling was a grave marker. The Eriksson family, taken by fever in autumn, old Magnus the blacksmith, found frozen in his forge, the Bjornsson twins, barely past their naming day, buried beneath stones that would remain covered until spring's thaw. If spring ever came. Her breath clouded the glass as she counted the structures still standing. 14 houses remained upright, though only hers showed any sign of life, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the central hearth, quickly torn apart by the relentless wind. The rest stood like broken teeth against the white landscape, their thatched roofs collapsed under snow's weight or torn away by the storms that had battered the coast since the first frost. Behind her, Fenrir stamped in the makeshift stable she'd built into the longhouse's eastern wall. The great black stallion was all that remained of her former life, the last link to the days when Astrid Eriksdottir rode with jarls and kings, when her name carried weight from Bergen to the Orkney Islands. Now that name meant nothing to the wind and cold. Here, she was simply the last woman standing in a settlement the world had forgotten. She traced a finger along the window's wooden frame, feeling the gaps where the chinking had cracked. Soon, she'd need to burn more furniture to keep the fire alive, and after that, she pushed the thought away. Tomorrow's problems could wait for tomorrow's light. Fenrir whinnied softly, and she turned to check on him. The horse's dark coat had grown thick for winter, but she could see his ribs more clearly each day. The last of the stored hay was nearly gone, and the grain barrel sat less than half full. Even rationing carefully, she had perhaps 2 weeks of feed remaining, not enough to last until the passes cleared. She'd been doing the arithmetic for days, scratching calculations into the dirt floor with a charred stick. If she left now, riding hard for the settlement at Vindheim, Fenrir might have the strength to carry her through the mountain passes before the next storm hit. But that meant abandoning this place, the home her grandfather had built, the graves of her family, the responsibility she'd shouldered when everyone else had fled or died. The wind shifted, carrying a new sound that made her freeze. Voices. Child voices, calling through the storm. Astrid grabbed her sacks from the table and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the thick wood. The voices came again, faint, high-pitched, speaking words she almost recognized but couldn't quite place. The pronunciation was archaic, formal in a way that reminded her of the old stories her grandmother used to tell. She lifted the heavy bar and cracked the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from her grasp, driving ice crystals into her face like tiny knives. Through the swirling white, she saw 2 small figures struggling through the drifts near the village well. Children. 2 girls, perhaps 8 or 9 winters old, holding hands as they stumbled through snow that reached their waists. Their clothes, what little she could see of them, were wrong for the weather. Thin wool and torn linen, no furs, no proper boots. They should have been dead already. "Here," she shouted over the wind. "This way." The girls turned toward her voice, and for a moment the storm seemed to lessen. She caught a glimpse of pale faces framed by dark hair, eyes that reflected the dim light from her doorway like an animal's. Then the wind surged again, and she lost sight of them in the driving snow. Astrid forced the door wider and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, even through her thick woolen dress and fur-lined cloak. She'd faced the bitter winters of Iceland, survived nights on frozen battlefields, but this cold had teeth that sought bone. "Where are you?" she called. A hand touched her arm, and she spun to find both girls standing beside her. Up close, their resemblance to each other was startling. Not just twins, but mirror images carved from the same pale stone. Their lips were blue with cold, their small hands raw and red, yet they seemed more curious than afraid. "Astrid Eriksdottir," the first girl said, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "We have traveled far to find you." The words were Old Norse, but spoken with an accent Astrid hadn't heard since her grandmother's time. The formal structure, the careful pronunciation, it belonged to another age entirely. "How do you know my name?" she asked, but the wind was growing stronger, and the girls were swaying on their feet. Questions could wait. "Come inside, quickly," She ushered them through the door and dropped the bar back into place. In the sudden silence, broken only by the fire's crackling and Fenrir's gentle movements, she got her first clear look at her unexpected visitors, and felt the world shift beneath her feet. The girls stood dripping on her threshold, and Astrid's breath caught in her throat. Now, in the firelight's warm glow, their features were achingly familiar. The delicate bone structure, the way their dark hair fell in waves past their shoulders, the particular shade of blue in their eyes. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not her weathered face, but her own childhood, decades past. "Impossible," she whispered, then caught herself. Children needed warmth, not an old woman's muttering. She moved to the wooden chest beside her bed and pulled out 2 thick wool blankets. "Come closer to the fire. You'll catch your death standing there." The girls approached with careful steps, their bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. Astrid wrapped them each in wool, noting how they stayed close together, their movements perfectly synchronized. When was the last time she'd spoken to anyone? When had another person shared the warmth of her hearth? The miller's wife, perhaps, before the fever took her in the late autumn. Before that, old Henrik, when he'd stopped by for ale and stories of the old raids. Before everyone died and left her alone with memories and a slowly dying horse. "What are your names?" she asked, settling onto the 3-legged stool that had been her father's. The girls perched on the edge of her sleeping furs, close enough to the fire that steam began rising from their damp clothes. "I am Runa," said the first girl, the one who had spoken her name in the storm. "This is my sister, Sigrid." Astrid's heart clenched. Those names. She forced herself to breathe normally. Common enough names, surely. Half the girls born in the last generation carried them, but spoken in that archaic pronunciation with that formal cadence. "Where do you come from?" she managed. "Where are your parents?" Runa tilted her head, considering the question with an adult's gravity. "We come from far away. Our parents—" She exchanged a glance with Sigrid. "They cannot come." Evasive, but Astrid had been evasive herself at their age. Children had their reasons for secrets, especially orphaned ones. The roads were full of displaced families since the plague years. Those lucky enough to survive often wandered seeking relatives, shelter, any place that might take them in. She ladled warm broth from the pot hanging over the fire, watering it down to make it stretch. 3 bowls instead of 1. Already her careful rationing was disrupted. The arithmetic that governed her survival had suddenly become more complex. 2 more mouths to feed, 2 more bodies requiring warmth and shelter. Her stores, already insufficient for 1 person and 1 horse through the winter, would last perhaps half as long. But as she watched the girls cup the bowls in their small hands and drink gratefully, the calculation seemed distant and cold. When had she last heard laughter in this house? When had she last shared a meal that wasn't eaten in solitude, listening only to the wind's endless moaning and Fenrir's occasional snorts? "How did you know to find me here?" she asked as they ate. "The stories." Sigrid spoke for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's, but carrying the same formal accent. "They say Astrid Eriksdottir is honorable, that she protects those who cannot protect themselves." Stories. What stories could these children have heard? Her raiding days were long past, and the few songs that mentioned her deeds belonged to an earlier age. She'd been nobody special for years now, just another aging warrior trying to scratch out a living on bad land, another casualty of changing times and the long peace that had made her skills obsolete. Yet here were 2 children who spoke of her as if she mattered, as if the name she carried still held weight in a world that had largely forgotten it. Fenrir whinnied from his corner, and Astrid glanced toward the stable area she'd built. The stallion was all she had left of her former life, her companion through battles and raids, the last piece of the woman she'd been before settling in this dying village. Without him, she was truly nothing, just another old woman warming her bones by a fire that would eventually die. She'd been planning to leave. The thought had circled her mind for weeks like a carrion bird. Pack what she could carry, mount Fenrir, and ride for the passes before the next storm made travel impossible. Find somewhere with living people, perhaps work in someone's stable or kitchen in exchange for food and shelter through the winter. Now, looking at these girls wrapping themselves in her blankets, drinking her broth, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Purpose. The weight of other lives depending on her choices. It was terrifying and oddly exhilarating. "You can stay the night," she said finally. "Tomorrow we'll see about getting you somewhere safe." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered, where was safe for anyone anymore? And why did these children feel like both salvation and doom walking into her life on the winter wind? The girls settled into sleep with an ease that unsettled Astrid. They curled together beneath her spare furs like cubs in a den, their breathing synchronizing within moments. She sat watching them by the fire's dying light, her mind churning with questions that had no comfortable answers. Children didn't survive alone in winter storms. Not dressed as these two had been, not speaking the way they did, not knowing things they shouldn't know. Yet here they lay, peaceful and warm, as if walking through a killing blizzard was merely another evening's adventure. Sleep eluded her. She dozed fitfully in her chair, starting awake each time the wind rattled the shutters or Fenrir shifted in his stall. During one of these wakeful moments, she thought she heard the girls whispering together in the darkness, their voices too low to make out words, but carrying an urgency that made her skin crawl. When she looked toward their sleeping forms, however, they lay perfectly still. Dawn came gray and muted, filtered through clouds that promised more snow. Astrid rose stiffly from her chair, joints protesting the night spent sitting upright. The fire had burned low, and she fed it carefully with her dwindling supply of split wood. Soon she'd need to break apart another piece of furniture, the old grain chest perhaps, or one of the stools. The girls were awake, sitting up in their furs and watching her with those unsettling blue eyes. In daylight, their resemblance to her lost sisters was even more pronounced. The shape of their faces, the way Runa's left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right, the small scar on Sigrid's chin, details that made Astrid's breath catch. "Good morning," she said, forcing normalcy into her voice. "Are you hungry?" They nodded in unison, and she set about preparing a simple breakfast of porridge stretched with water and the last of her dried berries. The grain barrel was visibly lower now, and she found herself calculating again. How many meals remained, how far the stores might stretch with 3 mouths instead of 1. "We must leave today," Runa said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "before the next storm comes." Astrid paused in her stirring. "Leave? Where would you go?" "The passes are snowed in, and the nearest settlement is 3 days' ride in good weather." "We know the way," Sigrid added. "But we need help." Something in their tone made Astrid turn from the fire. The girls sat straighter now, their childlike demeanor replaced by an intensity that belonged on much older faces. Runa's eyes held a weight of knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. "What kind of help?" "Your horse," Runa said simply. "We need to borrow Fenrir." The words hit like a physical blow. Astrid set down the wooden spoon with deliberate care, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "My horse is not for borrowing. We would return him," Sigrid said, "when our journey is finished." "No." The refusal came sharp and immediate. Astrid had given these children shelter, food, warmth, things she could barely afford. But Fenrir was her lifeline, her only chance of surviving the winter. "Find another way." The girls exchanged a look, and something passed between them, a communication that needed no words. When they turned back to her, their expressions held a sadness that seemed ancient. "There is no other way," Runa said, "and there is no time." As if summoned by her words, the wind outside began to rise. What had been a gentle morning breeze grew into something harder, more purposeful. The shutters rattled against their hinges, and snow began pelting the windows with increasing force. Another storm, gathering strength. Astrid moved to the window and peered out through the gaps in the shutters. The sky had darkened to the color of old iron, and the wind carried that particular bite that promised a long, vicious blow. If this storm proved as fierce as the last one, travel would be impossible for days. "You see?" Sigrid's voice came from directly behind her, though Astrid hadn't heard the child approach. "Time grows short." "For what?" Astrid turned and found both girls standing closer than they should have been able to move in silence. What journey is so urgent that you'd risk death in a winter storm? Not our death, Runa said quietly. Yours. The words hung in the air like a blade. Outside, the wind howled with growing fury, rattling the longhouse's sturdy walls. Fenrir whinnied from his stall, a sound of unease that matched the sudden chill running down Astrid's spine. What do you mean? But even as she asked, part of her already knew. These children weren't what they seemed. Their knowledge, their strange speech, the way they'd appeared from a storm that should have killed them, all of it pointed toward something beyond the natural world. The girls watched her with eyes that held depths no child should possess, waiting for her to understand. And in that moment, Astrid realized she faced a choice that would change everything. Trust these mysterious children with her last hope of survival, or watch something terrible unfold. The storm outside grew stronger, as if responding to her indecision. Astrid backed away from the girls, her hand instinctively moving to the sacks at her belt. The familiar weight of the blade's handle grounded her, a tangible reminder of battles fought and survived. But what enemy could steal face when the threat wore the faces of children? My death, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. You speak of my death as if it's already decided. Neither girl answered immediately. They stood motionless as carved stone, their eyes following her retreat with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Outside, the storm's fury increased, and she could hear Fenrir stamping nervously in his stall. The great stallion had carried her through countless dangers. Raids along the Scottish coast, the bitter retreat from Dublin, the long journey home after her Shieldmaiden days ended. He'd never failed her, but giving him to these, what were they, children? Spirits? Figments of a mind finally cracking under the weight of isolation? You don't understand, she said, hating how her voice shook. Fenrir isn't just a horse. He's my only way out of here. Without him, I'll starve before spring. I'll freeze. I'll die in this place just like everyone else. The admission came out raw and desperate. She'd been so careful not to voice those fears, not even to herself. Speaking them aloud made them real, transformed the abstract mathematics of survival into cold certainty. 3 weeks of grain, maybe 4 if she ate nothing but thin gruel, the wood pile that dwindled daily, the relentless cold that crept through every gap in the walls, stealing warmth faster than her meager fire could provide it. Yes, Runa said softly. You will die here if nothing changes. We have seen it. Seen it. The words sent ice through Astrid's veins. She'd heard such claims before, from the old Volva who'd once traveled with her raiding crew. That ancient woman had spoken of visions and prophecies with the same matter-of-fact certainty these children displayed. I don't believe in prophecy, Astrid said, but her voice lacked conviction. I make my own fate. Sigrid tilted her head. Do you? Then why are you still here? The question struck deeper than any blade. Astrid opened her mouth to answer, duty, responsibility, honor, but the words wouldn't come. Why was she still here? The practical reasons had evaporated weeks ago. She could have left when the first families fled, could have ridden out with the merchant caravan that had stopped briefly in early winter, could have abandoned this dying place a dozen times over. Instead, she'd stayed, watching, waiting. For what? I protect what remains, she said finally. What remains? Runa gestured toward the shuttered window, beyond which lay empty houses and snow-covered graves. There is nothing left to protect. Everyone you knew is dead. Everyone you swore to defend has fled or fallen to plague and famine. You protect only ghosts. Each word was a blade thrust, finding the tender places where doubt had been growing like infection. Astrid had told herself she was the guardian of this place, the last keeper of its memory. But in truth, she was just a stubborn old woman too frightened to leave and too proud to admit it. The storm's howling intensified, and something struck the roof with tremendous force. Snow, probably, sliding off the neighboring longhouse. But it sounded like the footsteps of giants, like the approach of something vast and hungry. If you've seen my death, Astrid said, then you know I won't give you my horse. You know I'm too selfish to risk my last hope for 2 strange children who appeared from nowhere. We know many things, Sigrid said. "We know you rode with Eric Bloodaxe's raiders. We know you saved 17 men at the Battle of Stamford Bridge when the Saxon shield wall broke. We know you carried your wounded captain 3 miles through enemy territory, though arrows pierced your shoulder and thigh." Astrid's blood chilled. Those were not stories any child could know. The battle at Stamford Bridge, she'd never spoken of it to anyone in this village. It belonged to another life, another woman who'd believed in glory and honor and the songs skalds would sing. "We know you gave your share of the Dublin silver to the widow of Gunnar Iron Arm when he fell," Runa continued. "We know you refused 3 marriage offers from Jarls because you would not be caged by any man's hearth. We know the scar on your left arm came from defending a thrall girl from her master's whip." The litany of forgotten deeds fell like hammer blows. Some she hadn't thought of in years. Others were private shames she'd buried so deep that remembering them brought physical pain. How could these children know? Who could have told them? "What are you?" she whispered. The girls smiled then, expressions of infinite sadness and something that might have been love. "We are your choice," they said in unison. "And you are ours." Fenrir screamed from his stall, a sound of pure terror that shattered the moment. Through the storm's roar came an answering cry, something vast and hungry, drawing closer. The sound that answered Fenrir's scream was not of this world. It rolled across the mountains like thunder, but thunder with purpose, with malevolence. Astrid felt it in her bones, a vibration that made her teeth ache and her old wounds throb. She'd heard many terrible things in her warrior years, the death cries of men and beasts, the splitting of shields, the whistle of arrows finding their mark. This was worse. This was the sound of something that had never known mortality hunting those who did. "It comes," Runa said, her child's voice carrying impossible authority. "The hunger that devours light, the cold that kills hope. You have perhaps moments to choose." Astrid's mind reeled. Everything rational screamed against this madness. Children speaking prophecies, monsters prowling the winter night, her own past laid bare by impossible knowledge. Yet her warrior's instincts, honed through decades of violence and survival, recognized truth when it stalked her. Something was coming, something that would end her story in this frozen wasteland if she remained passive. Another roar shook the longhouse, closer now. Fenrir's terror infected her. The great stallion who'd never shown fear of wolf or bear, who'd charged Saxon shield walls without hesitation, was fighting against his tethers with desperate strength. Ice crystals fell from the rafters as the building shuddered. "The horse," Sigrid urged. "Give us the horse, and live. Keep him, and watch everything end." "You're asking me to trust you with my life," Astrid said. But even as the words left her lips, she was moving. Not toward the stable, but to her weapon's chest. If death was coming, let it find her armed. "You won't tell me who you are, where you're going, why you need him." "Because knowing would not help you choose," Runa replied. "Choice must come from the heart, not the head. From who you are, not what you understand." Astrid's hands found her grandfather's axe, its familiar weight a comfort against the impossible. The blade had tasted Saxon blood, Irish gold, the spray of northern seas. It had never failed her when steel could suffice. But the approaching presence felt beyond the reach of mortal weapons. A third roar, and this time the shutters exploded inward. Wind and snow blasted through the opening, extinguishing half her fire and plunging the longhouse into dancing shadows. Through the gap, she glimpsed something moving against the storm, a darkness that seemed to devour the very snow it touched. "Now," both girls said together, their voices harmonizing in a way that raised every hair on Astrid's neck. "Choose now, or lose the chance forever." Fenrir's screams had become continuous, a sound that would have drawn every predator within miles if any natural beasts still lived in these mountains. The darkness beyond the shattered window pulsed, growing larger, and Astrid caught a glimpse of eyes like dying stars. Her choice crystallized with sudden, terrible clarity. Not between death and survival. She'd faced those odds too many times to fear them now. This was between the woman she'd been and the woman she might yet become, between clinging to the last remnants of a life already over and stepping into something unknown but alive with possibility. between protecting herself and protecting others, one final time. "Damn you both," she whispered, but there was no anger in it, only recognition. She'd always known this moment would come, in one form or another, the moment when everything she'd fought to preserve would demand the ultimate price. Moving with the decisive speed that had kept her alive through 30 years of warfare, Astrid strode to Fenrir's stall. The great stallion turned toward her, his eyes rolling white with terror, but he gentled at her touch. Her hands found his tack with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar ritual of preparing for battle. "If you betray this trust," she told the girls as she worked, "if you were leading me into some elaborate doom, know that I go willingly. I choose to believe you because the alternative is choosing despair." "We know," Sigrid said softly. "That's why it must be you." The darkness beyond the window had grown massive now, blocking out the storm itself. As Astrid led Fenrir from his stall, she could feel its attention like ice water in her veins. The stallion pranced and shied, but followed her lead. They'd shared too many dangers for him to doubt her judgment now. The girls moved to either side of the great horse, their small hands finding his bridle with startling confidence. At their touch, Fenrir calmed, though his nostrils still flared at whatever approached through the storm. "Where will you take him?" Astrid asked, surprised by how steady her voice remained. "Where we must," Runa replied. "Trust that he will return to you changed, as you will be changed." Another roar shook the world, and the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. Astrid opened the door to howling wind and horizontal snow, stepping aside as the girls led Fenrir into the storm. She watched her last hope disappear into the killing night, and discovered she wasn't afraid. She was free. The door slammed shut behind them, rattling on its iron hinges as the storm swallowed the sound of Fenrir's hoofbeats. Astrid stood in the sudden silence, her empty hands still tingling from where she'd held the reins for what might be the last time. The longhouse felt cavernous without the stallion's presence, without his steady breathing and occasional snorts of contentment. Even the walls seemed smaller, pressing closer as if the building itself mourned her choice. The darkness beyond the shattered window writhed, no longer advancing but not retreating either. It hung there like smoke given malevolent purpose, watching, waiting. The eyes she'd glimpsed, those points of dying starlight, had vanished, but she could feel their attention boring into her soul. Then, impossibly, the thing began to withdraw. The oppressive weight that had settled over the longhouse lifted gradually, like morning fog burning away before the sun. The storm's howling diminished to normal winter wind, and snowflakes resumed their natural dance instead of the horizontal assault that had battered her walls. Whatever had come hunting, the girl's departure with Fenrir had satisfied it, or perhaps frustrated it enough to seek easier prey elsewhere. Astrid moved to her ruined window, avoiding the worst of the snow and ice scattered across the floor. Through the gap, she could see nothing but ordinary winter night, dark, cold, but no longer pregnant with supernatural menace. The village lay as it had for weeks, empty houses slowly disappearing beneath accumulating snow, the skeletal remains of hopes that had died with their owners. But something had changed, not in the landscape, but in her. The freedom she'd felt watching Fenrir disappear hadn't been despair disguised as acceptance. It was genuine liberation from the weight of futile guardianship. She was no longer the keeper of a dead place, the stubborn fool clinging to memories of what once was. She was simply Astrid again, not the village protector, not the failed guardian, but herself, a woman who'd made an impossible choice and discovered she could live with the consequences. The fire had died to embers during the confrontation. She fed it carefully, coaxing new flames from the remaining kindling. The routine task grounded her, restored some sense of normalcy to a night that had shattered every assumption about reality. As warmth began to spread through the room again, she found herself taking inventory with fresh eyes. 3 weeks of grain, as she'd calculated, less now, with no horse to carry her to other settlements, but also less urgency. The thing that had been hunting her was gone, at least for now. The storm would pass, as storms always did, and perhaps other travelers would come, as the girls had come. Perhaps she wouldn't face the remainder of winter alone. Or perhaps she would. The uncertainty no longer terrified her. A sound from outside made her freeze. Not the supernatural roar that had announced the dark presence, but something far more welcome. Hoofbeats. Steady, familiar. Approaching at an easy trot despite the snow and wind. "Impossible," she whispered, but her heart was already racing with hope. She threw open the door without regard for the cold, peering into the storm-torn night. Fenrir emerged from the swirling snow like a vision from the old stories. But this was not the horse she'd given away barely an hour before. His coat gleamed with impossible health, his eyes bright and alert, his movements carrying a fluid grace that spoke of supernatural vitality. More startling still were the runes carved into his flanks. Not wounds, but symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The stallion approached without hesitation, nuzzling her outstretched hand with familiar affection. His breath was warm against her palm, but it carried scents she didn't recognize. Mountain flowers that bloomed only in summer, sea salt from distant shores, the green smell of growing things that should have been impossible in the depths of winter. "Where did they take you?" she murmured, running her fingers along the glowing runes. The symbols were Old Norse, she realized, but arranged in patterns that predated any human writing she knew. They seemed to shift under her touch, rearranging themselves into new configurations that made her eyes water to follow. As she led Fenrir back to his stall, she noticed other changes. His hooves left prints in the snow that steamed as if walking on hot coals. His mane moved with air currents that didn't match the wind, and when she looked directly into his eyes, she saw depths that belonged to something far older and wiser than any mortal beast. The girls were gone. She'd known they wouldn't return with the horse, had sensed their departure was permanent the moment they'd led Fenrir into the storm. But they'd left something behind beyond her transformed companion. On the stable wall, written in what looked like her own blood, though she bore no fresh wounds, a message waited. "The first test is complete. Greater challenges await. Trust the path the runes reveal." Astrid touched the words, and they flared with brief warmth before fading to ordinary rust-colored stains. The runes on Fenrir's hide pulsed brighter in response, and suddenly she understood their purpose. Not decoration or blessing, but a map, a guide to somewhere that existed beyond the edges of her known world. Her real journey was just beginning. The blood-stained message faded to rust, but its meaning burned bright in Astrid's mind. She pressed both palms against the stable wall, feeling the phantom warmth where impossible words had blazed moments before. The wood was ordinary pine now, weathered and scarred by decades of use, giving no hint of the supernatural script that had marked it. Yet the runes on Fenrir's flanks continued their steady pulse, mapping territories that belonged more to saga than geography. "A path," she murmured, studying the shifting symbols. The patterns hurt to follow directly, her eyes watered and her head began to ache when she tried to trace their full meaning. But glimpses came through, mountain passes that defied the season's snow, valleys where summer flowers bloomed despite winter's grip, coastlines that existed beyond any charts she knew. Fenrir stood patiently as she examined him, but she could sense the change in his very nature. Where once he'd been her companion, now he was something more: guide, protector, perhaps even judge of whatever trials lay ahead. The intelligence in his dark eyes belonged to no mortal beast. When he turned his head to study her in return, she felt measured by something ancient and implacable. The practical implications struck her like a physical blow. Whatever those runes revealed, whatever path they mapped, it led away from this place, away from the village she'd sworn to protect, the empty houses she'd watched over, the familiar rhythms of a life that had already ended in everything but name. She'd spent weeks preparing for winter's siege, rationing grain and wood with miserly precision. Now the runes promised, or demanded, that she abandon those careful calculations for a journey into unknown lands. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself taking inventory with a warrior's eye for essential gear. Her grandfather's axe, certainly. the blade that had never failed her, her warmest cloak, the one lined with bear fur from her last successful hunt, dried meat and journey bread, what little remained of her hoarded supplies, the silver arm ring that represented her share of the Dublin raid, currency for whatever settlement she might encounter. But even as she planned, doubt crept in like winter cold through cracks in stone. The girls had spoken of tests and challenges with the certainty of those who'd seen what was to come. They'd known details of her past that should have been buried with the men who'd shared those battles, those moments of decision that had defined her character. If they possessed such knowledge, what did they know of what awaited her on this impossible path? Fenrir nickered softly, drawing her attention back to the present. The runes on his flanks had brightened, and she realized she could now make out individual symbols with less strain. A mountain peak wrapped in unnatural mist, a standing stone circle that pulsed with its own light, a hall with doors that opened onto different seasons simultaneously. Places of power. The kind of locations the old Volva had spoken of in whispered conversations around dying fires, where the barriers between worlds grew thin, where gods and mortals might still meet as they had in the elder days. "You want me to go there," she said to Fenrir, though she wasn't entirely sure the horse was what she was addressing. "To these places that shouldn't exist." The stallion's response was to turn toward the stable door, his meaning unmistakable. Not tomorrow, not when the storm passed, but now, tonight. While the path remained clear and whatever forces had set this in motion still held sway over natural law, Astrid felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had always preceded battle. The moment when planning ended and action began, when a warrior stopped calculating odds and committed to the fight regardless of outcome. She'd experienced it countless times, before ship-borne raids on foreign shores, before desperate stands against overwhelming numbers, before single combats where honor mattered more than survival. This felt the same, a point of no return disguised as choice. The storm was weakening, she realized. Through the stable's gaps, she could see stars beginning to pierce the cloud cover. The wind had dropped from a howl to a whisper, and the horizontal snow had resumed its natural descent. Whatever supernatural forces had brought the girls to her door were providing a window of opportunity, brief, perhaps, but sufficient for a determined traveler. Her hands moved without conscious decision, gathering the gear she'd identified. Fenrir stood motionless as she secured her pack behind his saddle, but she could sense his eagerness. Whatever transformation he'd undergone had left him as ready for this journey as she was reluctant to begin it. The last item she took was unexpected, a small carving her father had made, depicting the family farm where she'd spent her childhood. She'd carried it through every campaign, every winter, every year of wandering. It had no practical value, but it was the only thing that still connected her to the woman she'd been before the world taught her that survival required harder choices than a farmer's daughter could imagine. Now it would witness whatever she was becoming. She tucked the carving into her belt pouch with hands that trembled despite 30 years of steady weapon work. The small wooden farm, barely larger than her thumb, represented everything she was abandoning, the dream of settling down, of finding peace in familiar places, of dying in her own bed, rather than on some foreign shore or forgotten battlefield. But dreams were luxuries she'd surrendered long ago. Leading Fenrir from the stable, she paused at the threshold between shelter and storm. The wind had indeed gentled, but the cold was arctic, the kind that could freeze breath in lungs and turn exposed flesh to stone within minutes. Yet the runes on Fenrir's hide pulsed warmer, and where his hooves touched snow, steam rose as if he carried summer within his very bones. The first step into the storm was the hardest. Snow crunched under her boots with sounds like breaking glass, and the wind found every gap in her cloak despite the dying gale. But Fenrir moved with supernatural confidence, his transformed eyes cutting through darkness that should have blinded them both. The runes served as their compass, growing brighter when they turned toward paths that led away from everything she'd known. Behind them, the village disappeared with startling speed. Houses that had taken lifetimes to build vanished into swirling white as if they'd never existed. The longhouse where she'd made her impossible choice became another shadow among shadows, then nothing at all. Only the glow from Fenrir's markings remained constant, a warm pulse of light in the consuming darkness. They climbed. The path, if it could be called that, wound upward through terrain she'd never seen despite 20 years in these mountains. Stone formations loomed like sleeping giants, their surfaces carved with symbols that matched those on Fenrir's flanks. The wind carried sounds that belonged to no earthly storm, distant singing in languages she didn't recognize, the clash of weapons that rang with otherworldly resonance, voices calling across impossible distances. Her grandfather's axe bumped against her leg with each step, its familiar weight now feeling inadequate against whatever awaited them. Steel had always been her answer to impossible odds, sharp iron and trained reflexes overcoming superior numbers or strange circumstances. But the runes spoke of challenges beyond the reach of mortal weapons, tests that would measure the content of her soul rather than the strength of her sword arm. The temperature should have killed them both. Her breath formed ice crystals that should have warned of impending death, and the wind cut through even her bare fur cloak with razored precision. Yet Fenrir's warmth seemed to extend beyond his physical form, creating a bubble of survivable cold around them. Not comfort, never that, but the difference between freezing and merely suffering. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time moved strangely in the storm-wrapped darkness, stretched and compressed like heated metal under a smith's hammer. The path spiraled ever upward, toward peaks that shouldn't exist in these familiar mountains. When she looked back, once, the world below had vanished entirely, replaced by roiling mist that glowed with its own phosphorescence. Then the first test revealed itself. The path ended at a chasm that split the mountainside like a sword cut through stone. No bridge spanned the gap, no ledges offered passage around it. The far side lay perhaps 30 feet away, an impossible leap for any mortal horse, yet the runes on Fenrir's hide blazed with sudden urgency, pointing directly across the void. Below, darkness deeper than winter night swallowed all light. No bottom was visible, no sound echoed from fallen stones. The chasm might extend downward forever, a crack in the world itself that led to realms where different laws held sway. Astrid dismounted, studying the gap with a warrior's eye for tactical solutions. 30 feet of empty air, with death the certain consequence of failure. No room for clever maneuvering or alternative approaches. The path demanded absolute trust in Fenrir's transformed nature, in the supernatural forces that had guided them here, in the promise that selfless sacrifice would be rewarded rather than punished. Her hands found Fenrir's neck, feeling the pulse of otherworldly power beneath his midnight coat. The stallion showed no fear, only patient readiness. Whatever he'd become during his journey with the mysterious girls had prepared him for this moment. But preparation and certainty were different things entirely. "You're asking me to leap into the void," she whispered, her words instantly stolen by wind. "To trust that magic will carry us where courage cannot." Fenrir turned his great head toward her, and in his transformed eyes she saw reflection of her own deepest fear. Not death, which she'd courted countless times, but meaningless death. The terror that all her struggles, all her choices, all her stubborn attempts to protect what remained of her world would end in empty failure. The ordeal was not the chasm itself, she realized with sudden, terrible clarity. It was the decision to leap despite certainty of destruction, to choose faith over calculation, trust over control, surrender over the illusion of mastery that had defined her adult life. Behind them, the path had already begun to fade, claimed by mist and otherworldly cold. Forward lay only void and the rune's insistent promise. There was nowhere left to retreat. Astrid swung herself onto Fenrir's back with movements that felt like ritual, the last gestures of a woman who had lived by steel and calculation. The stallion's warmth spread through her legs, his supernatural vitality pulsing against her bones like a second heartbeat. But even that otherworldly strength felt fragile against the chasm's hungry darkness. "We faced worse odds," she lied, gathering the reins with fingers that had forgotten how to shake until this moment. The words rang hollow in the thin air. She'd charged Saxon shield walls, weathered North Sea storms that had claimed better ships than hers, survived plagues that had emptied entire settlements. But those had been mortal dangers, governed by natural law. This was pure void, an absence that devoured light, sound, hope itself. Fenrir took 3 measured steps backward, his hooves finding purchase on stone that shouldn't have held in the ice and wind. The runes along his flanks blazed brighter, casting their only light into the consuming darkness. For a heartbeat, she saw the far side clearly. Solid rock, continuation of the path, the promise of answers to questions that had driven her from everything familiar. Then the light dimmed, and only faith remained. "For honor," she whispered, the old battle cry that had carried her through a dozen campaigns. But the words crumbled even as she spoke them. Honor belonged to the world of men, of comprehensible victories and defeats. Here, only surrender had meaning. Fenrir launched himself forward. For 3 strides, she felt his power gathering beneath her, muscles moving with precision beyond any mortal horse, each step bringing them closer to the edge where stone gave way to nothing. The wind screamed around them, carrying voices that might have been her name or might have been her doom. The chasm yawned wide, its darkness reaching up like grasping fingers. Then they leaped. The moment of suspension stretched into eternity. Fenrir's hooves left solid ground, and 30 feet of emptiness opened beneath them like a mouth. The far side hung impossibly distant, a target that belonged to dreams rather than achievable reality. Wind battered them from all directions, as if the storm itself sought to claim them for the void. But worse than the physical sensation was the sudden absence, not just of ground beneath them, but of the supernatural warmth that had sustained them through the climb. The runes on Fenrir's flanks flickered once, twice, then died to barely visible tracery. His transformed strength guttered like a candle in hurricane wind. Whatever power had carried them this far was failing at the moment they needed it most. They were falling. Not gracefully, not with the measured descent of a planned leap, but plummeting like stones into darkness that had no bottom. Astrid felt Fenrir's body convulse beneath her as his otherworldly nature abandoned him, leaving only a mortal horse attempting the impossible. His desperate whinnying was lost in the chasm's roar, but she felt his terror through the saddle, the awful realization that magic had deserted them both. The far ledge rushed past, 3 feet beyond the reach of his outstretched hooves, 3 feet that might as well have been 300. Below them, darkness opened without limit, promising a fall that would last until they died of terror before striking whatever bottom waited in the world's roots. Her grandfather's axe slipped from her belt, vanishing instantly into the void. The wooden carving of her family's farm followed, 40 years of memories scattered like chaff on wind that belonged to no earthly storm. Even her warmest cloak tore free, the bear fur that had protected her through countless winters claimed by forces that cared nothing for human preparation. But the true loss was deeper than possessions. In the moment of absolute failure, she felt her sense of self unraveling like a badly woven cloak. The identity she'd forged through decades of impossible choices, protector, survivor, the woman who endured what others could not, cracked apart against the reality of helplessness. All her strength, all her stubborn will, all her refusal to surrender, meant nothing against the simple fact of falling. They struck the chasm wall with impact that drove breath from her lungs and consciousness from her thoughts. Stones scraped away skin and hope in equal measure. Fenrir's scream echoed off invisible walls as they tumbled deeper, his hooves scrabbling for purchase on smooth rock that offered no mercy to mortal desperation. Darkness claimed her before they stopped falling, but not before she understood the test's cruel lesson. The leap itself had never been the challenge, it was designed to fail. The real trial lay in falling, in watching everything she'd trusted stripped away layer by layer until only the core of her being remained, if anything remained at all. Her last coherent thought, as stone and void closed over her like a burial shroud, was that the girls had known this would happen. They'd sent her here not to succeed, but to be broken completely, to discover what, if anything, would survive when Astrid Eriksdottir was reduced to her most essential elements. The answer, it seemed, was nothing at all. The answer was not nothing at all. Consciousness returned like dawn breaking through winter clouds, gradual, reluctant, bringing with it the understanding that she still existed when existence should have been impossible. Astrid lay on her back against stone that should have been far above her head, breathing air that should have been crushed from her lungs, feeling pain that should have been beyond mortal endurance. But she was not mortal, not anymore. The realization came not as thought but as certainty that flowed through her bones like molten silver. The fall had indeed stripped away everything she'd believed herself to be: warrior, protector, survivor. But beneath those accumulated identities lay something older, something that had been sleeping in her blood since birth, waiting for the moment when all pretense was finally torn away. She sat up slowly, expecting agony from the impact against stone. Instead, her body moved with fluid grace, unmarked by their plummet into the void. Beside her, Fenrir raised his great head, and she saw in his transformed eyes the reflection of her own change. The runes on his flanks blazed with renewed fire, but now she could read them as easily as her own name. Daughter of Odin, blood of the Aesir, the Wanderer's chosen. Impossible, she whispered. But even as she spoke the denial, memories surfaced that had been buried beneath 45 years of mortal living. A mother who had vanished when she was 3, leaving behind only stories of distant places and older gods. A grandfather who had taught her to fight not with human technique, but with instincts that came from somewhere beyond learned skill. The dreams that had plagued her since childhood, visions of great halls where warriors feasted eternal, of ravens that spoke in human voices, of a one-eyed wanderer who watched her from across impossible distances. The girls had not been her sisters returned from death. They had been Valkyries, sent to guide her to this moment of awakening. The test had never been about surviving the leap. It had been about dying to her mortal self so that her divine nature could finally emerge. She rose to her feet, and the movement felt like the first time she had ever truly stood. Power flowed through her limbs, not the mere strength of trained muscle, but something that connected her to the foundations of the world itself. The chasm that had seemed impossible to cross now appeared as merely another step on a path she was finally ready to walk. But with divine awareness came divine responsibility, and the weight of it staggered her more than the fall ever had. Every choice she'd made, every moment of selfless sacrifice, every time she'd chosen protection over profit, honor over survival, they had all been tests: the plague that had taken her village, the bitter winters she'd endured alone, the countless battles where she'd stood between innocents and those who would harm them. All of it had been preparation for this revelation. She was not merely Astrid Eriksdottir, last guardian of a dead settlement. She was the Wanderer's daughter, placed in mortal form to walk among humans and judge whether they still possessed the capacity for sacrifice that had once earned them the gods' favor. Her own willingness to give her last horse to 2 starving children had been the final test, not of her mortality, but of her readiness to reclaim her birthright. The truth crashed over her in waves that remade her understanding of everything that had come before: her impossible survival through plague and famine, her ability to endure hardships that had killed stronger warriors, the way desperate people had always found their way to her door, seeking protection she somehow managed to provide despite overwhelming odds. She had been a god walking among mortals, unconscious of her own nature, learning through lived experience what it meant to be human. The compassion she developed, the fierce protectiveness that had defined her choices, the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who couldn't protect themselves, these were not merely human virtues. They were divine qualities, refined through mortal experience into something purer than either realm could achieve alone. "The old compact is broken," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that had never been there before. The words echoed from stone walls that glowed with responding power. The gods withdrew because humanity forgot how to earn their favor. But some still remember. Fenrir nickered agreement, and she understood that he too had always been more than he seemed. Not her horse, but her mount, the eight-legged Sleipnir's own offspring, sent to carry her through realms mortal steeds could never traverse. Around them, the chasm began to change. The walls drew closer. The darkness above gave way to starlight that spelled out her true name in ancient runes. A path materialized beneath their feet. Not the narrow ledge she'd tried to leap, but a bridge of crystallized light that spanned not just the gap before them, but the void between worlds themselves. The revelation was complete, but the journey had only begun. She was no longer seeking answers to mortal questions, but preparing to judge whether the world of men deserved the return of divine protection, or if humanity had fallen too far into darkness to be saved. The weight of that decision settled on her shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and storm. The bridge of crystallized light stretched before them, each step singing with harmonics that resonated through her transformed bones. But as Astrid led Fenrir across the span between worlds, the magnitude of her awakening began to settle into something more manageable than overwhelming revelation. Divine nature or not, she still carried the practical mind of a warrior who had survived by planning carefully and gathering resources before battle. She paused at the bridge's center, where the light pulsed strongest, and extended her newfound awareness outward like a scout testing unfamiliar terrain. The sensation was unlike anything from her mortal years, her consciousness flowing beyond flesh to touch the threads that connected all living things. Through those threads, she felt the state of the world she'd been called to judge. It was worse than she'd imagined. The plague that had claimed her village was merely one tendril of a greater darkness spreading across Midgard. Famine stalked the northern settlements while war consumed the south. But beneath these mortal catastrophes lay something more poisonous, a creeping despair that convinced people they were alone in an indifferent cosmos. The old stories were dying, taking with them the understanding that sacrifice and honor still mattered to forces beyond human comprehension. Yet even through that spreading darkness, she found lights that burned with familiar fire. A fisherman's widow sharing her last meal with shipwreck survivors. A jarl protecting enemy children during a raid, choosing mercy over revenge. A young skald keeping the old tales alive despite mockery from those who called such stories empty superstition. Each act of selfless courage blazed like a beacon in her divine sight, proof that humanity's capacity for nobility had not been entirely extinguished. "They're scattered," she murmured, understanding beginning to crystallize into purpose. The worthy ones, isolated, struggling alone, believing themselves the last guardians of virtue in a fallen world. Fenrir's response carried meaning beyond sound, agreement, but also urgency. Time was running short. The darkness that fed on despair grew stronger with each act of cruelty, each moment when good people chose safety over sacrifice. Soon, the balance would tip beyond recovery, and the gods would have no choice but to abandon Midgard entirely. But what if the scattered lights could be gathered? What if those who still held to the old virtues could find each other, remember their strength, kindle hope in others who had forgotten how to resist the encroaching night? The plan that emerged felt like remembering something she'd always known. Not divine intervention, that age had passed, but divine inspiration working through mortal hands. She would use her awakened nature to find the worthy ones, to forge connections between isolated defenders of honor, to help them understand that their struggles mattered more than they'd dared to believe. The bridge beneath them began to shift, responding to her crystallizing purpose. What had been a simple span of light branched and multiplied, creating pathways that led not just forward, but to every corner of Midgard where courage still flickered. She could see them now, the roads she would need to travel, the allies waiting unknowingly for her call. A berserker in the eastern fjords who fought only to protect the innocent, never for glory or gold. A wise woman in the Shetlands whose healing arts preserved both body and spirit. A young chieftain in Iceland who chose justice over profit, earning his people's devotion while richer lords mocked his honor. Each represented a thread in a tapestry that could yet be rewoven into something worthy of the gods' return. But gathering them would require more than divine revelation. These were mortals who had learned to trust their own strength, their own judgment. They would not follow proclamations or miracles. They would need to see through deed and sacrifice that the old ways still offered power to those brave enough to embrace them, which meant she would need to learn how to be mortal again, at least in appearance. To walk among humanity, not as an awakened goddess, but as a warrior who had found purpose beyond herself. The divine awareness would remain, guiding her to those who could be trusted, but her approach would have to speak to human hearts, rather than overwhelming them with supernatural truth. Fenrir snorted approval as the plan solidified in her mind. He had always been her faithful mount. Now he would be her partner in a quest that could reshape the balance between divine and mortal realms. Together, they would travel the pathways of light that stretched before them, gathering the scattered champions of virtue, one by one. The weight on her shoulders shifted from burden to responsibility gladly accepted. This was what she had been prepared for through 45 years of mortal struggle, not to judge humanity's worth from divine distance, but to fight alongside those who refused to surrender hope, to remind them through her example that their sacrifices mattered, their courage had meaning, their stubborn defense of honor could yet tip the balance back toward light. The first path beckoned, a thread of silver leading toward the eastern fjords, where a lone berserker held a vital pass against raiders who would slaughter innocents. She mounted Fenrir with movements that felt like accepting a sacred charge. The gathering had begun. The silver thread led them through landscapes that shifted between the familiar geography of Midgard and something older, the world as it had been when gods and mortals walked the same paths. Astrid found herself adapting to the strange rhythm of divine travel, where distance meant less than intent, and the journey itself served as preparation for what awaited at its end. As they descended from the realm of crystallized light toward the eastern fjords, she felt her awakened nature settling into something more controlled. The overwhelming awareness that had flooded her during the revelation compressed into focused perception, still far beyond mortal limits, but manageable enough that she could function among humans without revealing her transformation. The divine fire in her blood banked to a steady warmth that would fuel her strength without blazing from her eyes like Fenrir's otherworldly intelligence. She would need that control soon. Through the silver thread's guidance, she could sense their destination, a narrow pass where mountain walls squeezed an ancient trade route into a corridor barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast. For 3 days, a single warrior had held that gap against a raiding party that should have overrun him within hours. His name came to her on winds that carried more than weather, Bjorn Ironwill, whose father had died defending the same pass a generation before. But as they drew closer, her divine senses detected troubling details the thread of light had not revealed. Bjorn's strength was failing. 3 days of constant battle had pushed even his berserker's endurance beyond breaking. The raiders, a dozen hardened killers led by a man who wore scalps like trophies, were preparing their final assault. In the valley beyond the pass, the farming settlement Bjorn protected went about their evening routines, unaware that their defender's shield arm could barely lift his weapon. This was no simple rescue, she realized. This was her first test as a gatherer of the worthy, not just finding those who held to the old virtues but proving that their sacrifices could achieve something beyond noble death. They materialized from the mountain mists, just as the raiders began their charge. Astrid had chosen her appearance carefully, a battle-scarred warrior woman whose gear spoke of experience rather than wealth, mounted on a horse that appeared powerful but not impossibly so. To mortal eyes, she would seem like a veteran sellsword, perhaps drawn by reports of the battle. Only those with the sight would notice the way shadows bent around them, or how Fenrir's hoofbeats rang with harmonics that made the stone walls hum. Bjorn stood alone at the pass's narrowest point, swaying with exhaustion but still grimly functional. His shield was split nearly in half, his sword notched from parrying axes, but his eyes burned with the same stubborn fire that had sustained her through 45 years of impossible choices. When he saw her approaching, he didn't call for help. Instead, he raised his battered weapon in salute, acknowledging a fellow warrior without assumption of aid. That gesture decided her approach. This man understood honor as she did, earned through deed, not proclaimed through words. She dismounted and drew her sword. Not the grandfather's blade lost in the chasm, but something that had manifested with her awakening, steel that sang with the memory of every righteous battle ever fought. "Your line has held this pass for generations," she called, her voice carrying easily over the raiders' war cries. "I'd consider it an honor to stand with Iron Will blood one more time." Bjorn's cracked lips curved into something approaching a smile. "Then stand welcome, sister warrior. Though I warn you, these dogs fight dirty and die hard." "Good," Astrid replied, settling into the defensive stance that had served her through a dozen campaigns. "I've grown tired of easy victories." The raiders struck like a landslide of malice and steel. But where they expected to overwhelm a dying berserker and his single ally, they found something they hadn't prepared for. Two warriors who fought not just with skill, but with purpose that burned brighter than their exhaustion or fear. Astrid let her divine nature fuel her movements without revealing its source. To Bjorn's eyes, she was simply a master swordswoman whose technique complemented his berserker's fury perfectly. Together, they turned the narrow pass into a killing ground where the raiders' numbers became liability rather than advantage. When the last attacker fell, Bjorn leaned heavily on his sword, staring at her with newfound respect. "I've heard tales of shield sisters who fight like the Valkyries themselves," he said quietly. "Never thought to stand beside one." "Perhaps," Astrid replied, careful not to lie while avoiding truth he wasn't ready for. "The old stories hold more power than most believe." She saw understanding kindle in his eyes, not of her divine nature, but of possibility he'd thought lost forever. The first thread was woven. Through Bjorn, she would reach others who still believed sacrifice mattered, who still fought for something beyond themselves. The gathering continued, one worthy soul at a time. The gathering took on momentum, like stones rolling downhill, each connection leading to the next with a certainty that felt like destiny unfolding. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter's grip, Astrid and her growing band of unlikely allies moved through the northern territories with purpose that transcended their mortal understanding. Bjorn had led them to the wise woman in the Shetlands, Ingrid Moonwhisper, whose knowledge of the old ways ran deeper than herb lore and bone-setting. Through her network of ravens and coastal traders, they found Eric Truthspeaker, the young Icelandic chieftain who had bankrupted himself feeding refugees from the southern wars. Each addition to their number brought new threads of connection, new paths to others who burned with the same stubborn flame of righteousness. But as their strength grew, so did the attention they attracted. The darkness that fed on despair had begun to notice their interference with its spreading influence. What had started as isolated acts of heroism was becoming something more dangerous, a movement that threatened to rekindle hope in places where it had been systematically extinguished. The first direct challenge came at the ruins of Hammerfell Abbey, where they had tracked reports of a plague-bearer who turned healing sanctuaries into charnel houses. They arrived to find not a diseased vagrant, but something that wore human form while radiating corruption, that made the very stones weep black moisture. A draugr, but one that served powers darker than simple undeath. "You gather them like a shepherd collects sheep," the thing spoke with voices that layered and echoed unnaturally, building hope where despair should reign. This cannot be permitted. The battle that followed tested everything Astrid had learned about balancing her divine nature with mortal leadership. She could have unmade the creature with a thought, revealed her true power and ended the threat instantly. But that revelation would have changed her relationship with the others, transformed followers into worshippers when what she needed were partners who chose courage for its own sake. Instead, she fought alongside them as their equal, using her awakened awareness to coordinate their efforts without commanding them. Bjorn's berserker fury, channeled by her subtle guidance, struck at precisely the moments when Ingrid's blessing made his blade most potent. Eric's tactical mind, enhanced by divine inspiration he attributed to battlefield clarity, positioned their forces to exploit weaknesses only Astrid could truly perceive. When the draugr fell, reduced to dust that scattered on winds suddenly clean again, her companions looked to her with expressions that made her chest tighten. Not worship, but the recognition shared between warriors who had found their true war leader. They saw her as the best of themselves, skilled beyond compare, but still fundamentally human in her dedication to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. That night, as they camped in the abbey's restored walls, Ingrid approached her with eyes that held uncomfortable perception. "There are stories," the wise woman said quietly, "of gods who walked among mortals to test their worth. They say such beings burned with inner fire that no winter could touch." Astrid met her gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying. "What do you think of such stories?" "I think," Ingrid replied carefully, "that divine blood or mortal, a leader is judged by the choices they make for those in their care. And I think the gods would be pleased with what you've built here." But even as bonds of trust deepened among her growing company, Astrid felt larger forces stirring in response to their successes. The scattered lights of courage they had been kindling were beginning to connect, forming a network that stretched across the northern lands like a constellation emerging from clouds. Word spread of the band that appeared wherever evil grew too bold, that stood with the desperate against impossible odds and somehow prevailed. The response was gathering too. Every cruel jarl whose authority depended on fear, every merchant who profited from others' desperation, every voice that whispered submission was safer than resistance. They were beginning to organize, to coordinate their efforts to snuff out the growing movement before it could spread further. More troubling still, she sensed something vast and patient shifting its attention toward them. Not mortal opposition, but forces from the spaces between worlds. Entities that had fed on humanity's descent into cynical despair and would not surrender their feast without a fight that would shake the foundations of reality itself. The final test was approaching, and she could feel its weight like storm clouds building beyond the horizon. Everything they had built, every connection forged, every flicker of hope rekindled, it would all be measured against whatever emerged from that gathering darkness. Standing watch as her companions slept, Astrid looked up at stars that seemed to pulse with anticipation. Fenrir moved beside her, his otherworldly eyes reflecting the same understanding that settled in her bones like certainty. The war for humanity's soul was about to begin in earnest. The darkness came with the dawn. Astrid felt it first as a wrongness in the very air, a pressure that made Fenrir's ears flatten and sent birds fleeing from trees in panicked clouds. Her divine senses recoiled from something vast and malevolent materializing at the edges of perception, not arriving, but manifesting, as if reality itself was being rewritten to accommodate its presence. She roused her companions with urgent whispers, though their mortal instincts had already begun responding to the wrongness. Bjorn's hand found his axe before his eyes opened. Ingrid muttered protective charms under her breath. Eric was already scanning the tree line with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. "What is it?" Bjorn growled, but his question died as the horizon began to bleed. The sky cracked like broken glass, revealing not the void beyond but something worse, an absolute darkness that devoured light without reflection or echo. Through those wounds in reality stepped figures that had once been human but were now vessels for something ancient and hungry. Their leader wore the face of a man Astrid recognized from divine memory, Jarl Blodax, who had died screaming in flames 3 winters past after feeding his own people to raiders for profit. But the thing that puppeted his corpse was far older than his crimes. When it spoke, the voice carried harmonics that made stones crack and set Fenrir's divine nature blazing in response. Astrid Eriksdottir, the awakened one who thinks to kindle hope where only despair should grow. The dead Jarl's lips moved, but the words came from everywhere and nowhere. "You have gathered your little lights, your stubborn flames of righteousness. How precious, how futile." Around the thing that wore Bloodaxe's face, more figures emerged from the bleeding sky. Each bore the corrupted form of someone who had chosen cruelty over compassion, who had fed the growing darkness through countless small betrayals of their own humanity. But they were merely vessels now, hollow shells animated by entities that had feasted on despair since the world's foundation. Astrid stepped forward, feeling her divine nature respond to the direct challenge. This was it. The confrontation she had sensed approaching. Not just a battle between good and evil, but a fundamental test of whether hope could survive when faced with the full malevolence of forces that had been corrupting humanity from the shadows for millennia. "You speak of futility," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself ring like struck bronze. "Yet you come in force against mortal warriors. That suggests considerable concern for our little lights." The thing's laugh was the sound of children weeping in empty houses. "We come to offer correction, to remind this realm that mercy is weakness, that sacrifice is waste, that courage dies screaming when faced with inevitable darkness." But even as it spoke, Astrid felt something unexpected. Not just her own divine power rising to meet the challenge, but responses from her companions that blazed with their own supernatural intensity. Bjorn's berserker nature kindled beyond mortal limits, touching something primal and unconquerable. Ingrid's connection to the old wisdom deepened until she spoke words that had not been heard since gods walked openly among men. Eric's tactical awareness expanded into something approaching prophecy, seeing paths through chaos that no mortal mind should comprehend. They were not merely mortal anymore. The choice to stand with her, to kindle hope against overwhelming darkness, had awakened something in each of them, not full divinity, but touches of the divine that came when mortals proved themselves worthy of standing between the darkness and the light. "You underestimate them," Astrid said, drawing her blade. The weapon sang with light that made the entities recoil even as they prepared to attack. "You see only their mortality. You miss their choice to stand regardless of odds, to fight because it is right rather than because they can win." The battle erupted with violence that shattered the boundaries between mortal and divine combat. The entities struck with powers drawn from the spaces between worlds, wielding despair itself as a weapon. Where their touch fell, hope withered, and courage turned to ash. But Astrid and her companions fought with something the darkness had forgotten how to counter, not just power, but purpose that transcended self-preservation. Each blow they struck was backed by the memory of every kindness they had witnessed, every sacrifice they had honored, every moment when someone had chosen right over easy. When Bjorn's axe bit into the thing wearing Bloodaxe's face, it shrieked with voices of every soul it had corrupted. When Ingrid's words of binding wrapped around lesser entities like chains of starlight, they thrashed with the fury of ancient hunger denied. When Eric's tactical genius turned their own dark powers against them, reality itself seemed to applaud the justice of it. But it was Astrid who struck the killing blow, not with her blade, but with the simple truth that rang from her divine nature like a bell tolling across all the 9 worlds. Humanity endures. Humanity chooses light, and that choice will always matter more than your hunger. The entities screamed as one and dissolved, their borrowed forms crumbling as the sky healed itself overhead. In the sudden silence, Astrid felt the balance of the world shift subtly back toward hope. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of reality settling back into its proper shape. Where moments before the very air had reeked of corruption, now clean wind swept across the battlefield, carrying the scent of snow and pine that belonged to the world as it should be. But victory, Astrid realized with growing clarity, had not come without cost. She felt it first as a hollowness in her chest, a sense of something fundamental draining away like water through cracked stone. The divine fire that had blazed within her since her awakening was dimming, not extinguished but diminished. Each word of power she had spoken, every moment of divine truth that had struck at the entities' hearts had burned away portions of what made her more than mortal. Her companions were experiencing their own reckonings. Bjorn swayed on his feet, his berserker's fury fading to leave him more depleted than any mortal battle had ever managed. The supernatural awareness that had guided his axe was gone, leaving behind only the echo of what it felt like to touch the divine. Ingrid's eyes, which had blazed with otherworldly knowledge throughout the fight, now held the confused wonder of someone waking from prophetic dreams they couldn't quite remember. Eric alone seemed unchanged, his tactical mind still sharp and clear. But Astrid could see the weight settling on his shoulders as he understood what they had accomplished, and what it meant for everything that followed. "The network," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the restored battlefield. "Every light we've kindled, every person we've inspired to choose hope over despair, They felt this battle, didn't they? They felt us stand against the darkness and win. Astrid nodded, though the movement cost her more effort than it should have. The victory will echo, word will spread that the old powers of corruption can be faced and defeated. But she didn't need to finish. They all understood that this was not an ending but a beginning. The entities they had destroyed were symptoms, not the disease itself. There would be others drawn by the very hope they had fought to protect. The choice to stand against ultimate darkness had marked them, made them targets for every force that fed on human despair. The cost, Bjorn rumbled, testing the weight of his axe and finding it heavier than before. We're not what we were, are we? That power, that certainty, it's gone. Not gone, Astrid corrected, though she felt the truth of his words in her bones. Spent. Used for what it was meant for. She looked at each of them, seeing the change that struggle against primordial evil had wrought. We touched the divine to stand against the diabolic. That touch burns away what we were to forge, what we needed to become. The real sacrifice was becoming clear now, settling over them like the weight of destiny fulfilled. They had won not just a battle but a transformation of the very conflict between hope and despair. But the price was their ability to stand apart from that conflict any longer. We can't go back, Ingrid whispered, her wise woman's intuition grasping truths her depleted sight could no longer see directly. After this, after what we've become, we're part of it now. The eternal struggle between light and dark. We'll never be just mortal again, but we're no longer touched by the divine either. Astrid felt Fenrir's warm breath against her shoulder as the great horse moved closer, offering comfort. Her companion had changed too. The otherworldly glow was gone from his eyes, but something deeper remained, a steadiness, a certainty that what they had chosen was right regardless of cost. The old gods, she said slowly, working through understanding that came not from divine insight, but from hard-won wisdom, they never promised their champions would be unchanged by victory. They promised only that the victory would matter. Around them, the world was already responding to what they had accomplished. She could sense it like distant music. Villages where despair had ruled the night before were stirring with new possibilities. Warriors who had been ready to lay down their arms were taking them up again, not in fury but in purpose. The network of hope they had spent months building was blazing to life, each connection strengthened by proof that darkness could be fought and beaten. But they would no longer stand at the center of that network as they once had. The divine spark that had made them more than mortal was spent, burned away to fuel the very victory that had saved the realm's soul. They were heroes now in the truest sense, those who had sacrificed not just their lives but their transcendence for others' salvation. So what now? Eric asked, ever practical even in the face of cosmic transformation. Astrid smiled, feeling the answer settle in her heart like coming home. Now we do what we've always done. We stand watch. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. We kindle hope wherever darkness gathers. She paused, meeting each of their eyes. But we do it as mortals who have seen the divine and chosen to remain human. The sacrifice was complete. The real work could begin. The weight of their transformation settled over them like the quiet after thunder, profound and inescapable. Astrid felt it in her bones first. The strange lightness of power spent, the hollowness where divine fire had once blazed. She was still herself, still the warrior who had given her last horse to two mysterious girls, but something fundamental had shifted. The godlike certainty that had guided her blade was gone, replaced by something more fragile and infinitely more precious, human choice, moment by moment, without the comfort of divine knowledge. Bjorn was the first to break the contemplative silence, testing his grip on his axe with movements that spoke of a man relearning his own strength. Feels like waking from a dream where you could fly, he muttered, then looked up with a rueful grin. Not complaining, mind, just different. Different, Ingrid agreed, though her voice carried wonder rather than loss. She flexed her fingers as if surprised to find them merely mortal, no longer conduits for otherworldly wisdom. I spoke words during the battle that I cannot remember now, felt knowledge flow through me that came from the very foundations of the world. But what remains? She paused, searching for the right phrase. What remains feels truer somehow, earned rather than given. Eric had been studying the horizon with the methodical attention he brought to all tactical assessments, but now he turned back to them with something like satisfaction in his weathered features. The network is responding. I can feel it, not with supernatural awareness, but the way a veteran feels a battle's tide turning. People are moving, acting. The hope we've been building isn't just surviving the test, it's growing stronger because of it. Astrid nodded, though even that simple movement reminded her of mortality's constraints in ways she had almost forgotten. The divine strength that had carried her through months of supernatural conflict was gone, but in its absence, she discovered something unexpected: relief. The burden of standing between humanity and cosmic forces had lifted, distributed now among countless souls who had witnessed their victory and chosen to carry light forward in their own small ways. The girls, she said suddenly, the memory surfacing with crystalline clarity, my sisters or the divine messengers wearing their faces, they knew this would happen. The whole chain of events, from that first impossible choice to this moment. They didn't give me power to keep. They gave me the opportunity to spend it on something that mattered. Fenrir whickered softly, nuzzling her shoulder with an affection that was purely equine now, no longer touched by otherworldly intelligence. Yet somehow the loss of his supernatural nature made his loyalty more meaningful, not less. He had chosen to remain with her when divine purpose no longer bound him to her service. So we go back to being what we were before? Bjorn asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No, Astrid replied firmly. We go forward as what we've become. Mortals who have stood against the ultimate darkness and proven that courage doesn't require divine backing. Humans who have seen the face of evil and chosen to kindle hope anyway. She looked at each of her companions, seeing them with eyes cleared of supernatural perception, but sharpened by shared purpose. They were scarred now, marked by their sacrifice in ways that went deeper than flesh, but they were also unified in a way that transcended their lost divinity. They had burned away their chance at transcendence to save others' capacity for the same choice. The real work begins now, Eric observed. Without divine guidance to show us the path, we'll have to find it step by step. Make mistakes, learn from them. Build something lasting through trial and error rather than cosmic insight. As it should be, Ingrid added softly. The gods can inspire, but humans must choose. We've proven the choice is possible. Now others must make it for themselves. Around them, the morning continued its ordinary progression. Snow began to fall in gentle flakes that caught the strengthening sunlight. Birds returned to their interrupted songs, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked with the simple enthusiasm of a creature that knew only that its pack was safe. The world had returned to its normal rhythms, but those rhythms now carried an undertone of possibility that had been absent before. Astrid swung herself onto Fenrir's back, feeling the familiar comfort of his steady presence beneath her. Her companions mounted their own horses with movements that spoke of weariness, but also determination. They had work to do, not the cosmic battle between light and darkness, but the daily, endless, utterly human task of protecting those who needed protection and offering hope to those who had forgotten it was possible. Where to first? Bjorn asked, settling into his saddle with a grunt of effort. Astrid smiled, feeling the answer rise from her mortal heart, rather than divine knowledge. Wherever we're needed most. The same as always. They rode toward the horizon, 4 mortals who had sacrificed godhood for humanity's sake, carrying hope forward one choice at a time. The village of Ravensfjord appeared through the morning mist like something half-remembered from a dream. Astrid felt her breath catch as familiar shapes resolved into clarity. The weathered longhouse where she had learned to wield a blade, the ancient oak where her mother had taught her the old stories, the stone circle where she had first sworn oaths as a warrior. Everything was smaller than she remembered, worn by 3 decades of harsh winters and harder choices. But it was the smoke rising from chimneys that made her heart race. The settlement she had fled after her sister's deaths was not just surviving, it was thriving. Astrid. Bjorn's voice carried uncertainty as he studied her rigid posture. This is home, she finished quietly. Or what was home, before everything changed. They had ridden for 6 days since their transformation, following no divine guidance but simple human instinct toward the place where her story had truly begun. The network of hope they had built guided them in whispers and rumors, travelers speaking of a settlement that had somehow prospered despite the plague years, where refugees were welcomed and the old ways lived alongside necessary innovations. As they crested the final hill, Astrid saw the changes that time had wrought. The village had expanded, but organically, with careful attention to defensibility and community needs. New longhouses bore architectural touches that spoke of refugees from distant lands, their building styles adapted to local conditions through practical compromise rather than stubborn isolation. Riders approaching the gate. The sentry's call rang across the settlement, and Astrid felt a shock of recognition. That voice, deeper now but unmistakable, little Olaf Stoneson, who had barely reached her shoulder when she left. Now he stood atop the palisade as a full-grown warrior, his eyes sharp and alert as he studied their approach. The gates opened before they reached them, and Astrid felt her throat tighten as familiar faces emerged. Thora the blacksmith, her hair gone silver but her arms still corded with muscle. Gunnar Olafsson, who had been barely old enough to hold a shield when plague took his parents. The wise woman Sigrid, moving more carefully now but with the same knowing eyes that had seen Astrid through her darkest hours. But it was the figure who pushed through the gathering crowd that stopped Astrid's heart entirely. Astrid? The voice was weathered by years and sorrow but unmistakable. Astrid Eriksdottir. Is that truly you? Erik the Elder, no longer elder now, but a man in his prime carrying the settled authority of leadership, stepped forward with careful wonder in his lined face. Behind him came others, men and women who had been children when she fled, now bearing the scars and confidence of those who had built something lasting from the ashes of loss. Erik, she managed, dismounting from Fenrir with movements that felt clumsy under so many watching eyes. The village, survived, he said simply, grew, learned to do more than simply endure. His gaze traveled over her companions, taking in their travel-stained clothing and the subtle marks that great deeds left on those who performed them. As did you, it seems. The reunion that followed was awkward in the way of all homecomings after profound change. Questions hung in the air. Where had she been? What had she done? Why return now after so many years of silence? But the village had learned patience in her absence, and their welcome was warm despite the uncertainty. It was Thora who cut through the careful politeness with characteristic directness. You look like someone who has been carrying the world, child, and like someone who has finally set it down. The insight was so accurate that Astrid felt tears threaten for the first time since the battle's end. Something like that, she admitted. We've been on a long road, but it brought us back here, where everything began. Then you are welcome for as long as you choose to stay, Erik declared, his words carrying the formal weight of leadership, but also genuine warmth. Your companions as well. Ravensfjord has always had room for those who stand against the darkness. That evening, gathered around the great fire in the expanded longhouse, Astrid found herself telling a carefully edited version of their journey. She spoke of villages saved and hope kindled, of choices made in desperate times and the strength that came from standing together. Her mortal voice carried only human authority now, but perhaps that made the story more powerful rather than less. These were deeds that mortals could imagine performing themselves. The network, Ingrid murmured during a quiet moment, watching children play near the fire with the unconscious confidence of those who had never doubted their safety. It extends to here, doesn't it? What we built reaches back to where you started. Astrid nodded, feeling the truth of it in her bones. The village that had shaped her had become part of the web of hope they had woven across the realm. Her homecoming was not an ending but a completion, the warrior who had left in shame and grief returning as someone who had learned to kindle light in the darkest places. She was home, but changed, and perhaps that made all the difference. 3 months later, Astrid stood in the rebuilt stable where everything had begun, running her fingers along Fenrir's flank, where the mystical runes had once blazed with otherworldly fire. Only the faintest scars remained now, pale lines that caught the morning light like old silver. The great horse had settled into mortal rhythms as easily as she had, content to carry children on gentle rides and pull plows when the spring planting demanded it. Still searching for answers? Ingrid's voice carried gentle amusement as she entered with an armload of fresh straw. Finding peace, Astrid replied, surprised by the truth of it. I spent so long fighting, first my grief, then the darkness, then the weight of divine purpose. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. The village had embraced them all with a completeness that still took her breath away. Bjorn had thrown himself into training the younger warriors, his booming laughter echoing from the practice yards as he taught them that strength without joy was merely brutality. Erik worked with the village council, his tactical mind helping them plan expansions and trade routes with the same careful precision he had once brought to supernatural battles. And Ingrid, wise woman that she was, had found her calling in the most unexpected place. The village's children flocked to her like moths to flame, drawn by stories that seemed to carry echoes of deeper truths even when stripped of their divine origins. She was building something precious, a generation that would grow up understanding that hope was a choice, not a gift from the gods. The messenger arrived this morning, Ingrid continued, her tone carefully neutral. From Nordheim. They're requesting aid. Strange disappearances, crops failing despite good weather, the same pattern we've seen before. Astrid felt the familiar stirring in her chest, the call to action that had driven her for so many months. But now it came without divine compulsion, rising instead from a choice made freely by a mortal heart that had learned the true weight of compassion. What do you think? She asked, though she already knew the answer. I think, Ingrid said with a smile that held both sorrow and determination, that some purposes outlast the power that first kindled them. We're not God's champions anymore, but we're still who we chose to become. By afternoon, they were ready to ride, not as divine warriors carrying cosmic fire, but as four humans who had learned that the greatest battles were won not through supernatural might, but through the simple refusal to let darkness go unopposed. The village gathered to see them off, faces that had become dear over the winter months, now tight with concern and pride. Erik, the elder, pressed a small carved raven into Astrid's hand. Your father made this for your mother when they first wed, he said quietly. She would have wanted you to have it, I think, something to remember that no matter how far you travel, you carry home with you. The weight of the carving was slight, but it seemed to anchor something deep in Astrid's chest. She looked around at the faces gathered to wish them well, children she had taught to ride, elders whose stories had filled the long winter evenings, warriors who had learned to see strength and gentleness as allies rather than enemies. We'll be back, she promised, the words carrying the certainty of someone who had finally learned the difference between fleeing and choosing one's path. We know, Thora called out with characteristic gruffness that couldn't quite hide her affection. This time, we trust you to return. As they rode through the gates, Astrid felt the familiar weight of purpose settling on her shoulders. But it was different now. Lighter somehow, despite being carried by mortal strength alone. She was no longer driven by divine mandate or cosmic necessity, but by something infinitely more precious, the knowledge that hope was worth defending precisely because it was fragile, precious because it could be lost. Behind them, Ravensfjord settled into its daily rhythms, smoke rising from chimneys where families gathered in the warmth of human connection. Ahead lay Nordheim, and whatever darkness had taken root there, another test of their chosen purpose. But between past and future, in this moment of riding toward uncertainty with companions who had become family, Astrid found something she had never expected to discover. She found peace with the journey itself. The network they had built would endure because it no longer depended on them alone. In villages across the realm, ordinary people were making the daily choice to kindle light in small spaces, to offer help to strangers, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. The divine spark had been spent not to create something supernatural, but to prove that the mortal heart was divine enough for any darkness it might face. Fenrir's steady hoofbeats carried her forward into whatever came next. No longer a god-touched warrior, but something far more powerful. A human being who had chosen hope as a way of life. The story that had begun with two little girls on a winter night had become something larger than prophecy or divine intervention. It had become a choice, made new each day.